up the game of Bohnanza, first set up the game area. To do this, first locate the bean card deck. For certain games, some of the cards in the bean card deck will be removed. In a 3-player game, remove the 4 cocoa beans from the game. In a 4 or 5-player game, remove the 24 coffee beans. And in a 6 or 7-player game, remove the 4 cocoa beans and the 6 garden beans. Place any of the removed bean cards back into the box. They will not be used during the game. After removing the necessary bean cards from the deck, shuffle the bean cards and place them face down in the middle of the playing area. Make sure to leave space next to the deck for a discard pile. Place the 3rd bean field cards in the box. They may be used during some games, so make sure the box is still accessible during the game. After setting up the game area, each player will set up their player area. To set up each player's area, they will start the game with a certain amount of bean cards based on the number of players playing. In a 3-player game, each player is dealt 5 cards and 1 3rd bean field card. 3rd bean field cards have 2 different sides. A player may place their 3rd bean field card in their player area with either side face up. In a 4 or 5-player game, each player is dealt 5 cards. And in a 6 or 7-player game, the dealer deals 3 cards to the player to their left. That player will be the starting player. They deal 4 cards to the next player in clockwise order, 5 cards to the next player, and 6 cards to all other players. Any cards that a player is dealt will become their hand. All players are allowed to look at their cards, but they may not rearrange them. Throughout the game, they will always keep their hand cards in the same order. After setting up the game area and each player's area, they are ready to start the game. During the game of Bohnanza, players are trying to collect matching bean cards in fields. The trick is they are not allowed to rearrange their hand cards, so they must use strategic donating and trading to get the cards they need. The ultimate goal is to score the most gold coins. The player to the left of the dealer will start as the active player. The active player will always do 4 steps during their turn. The first step of each player's turn is to plant bean cards. The player whose turn it is must plant the top card of their hand. While planting a card, a player places the top card from their hand into a field by setting it in front of them face up. Each player has 2 bean fields to plant their beans in during the game. If they have a 3rd bean field card in their player area, they may plant 3 bean fields. If they don't already have a 3rd bean field, they may purchase one during the game. This will be explained later in step 3. There are several rules players should know about planting beans in fields. First, each type of bean field may only hold 1 type of bean card. So when a player is planting a bean card, they may place it in an open field without any other beans, or they may place a bean in a field that already contains beans of the same type by placing it on top of the other beans. The second thing to know is that a player must always plant a bean card. So if they do not have an open bean field or matching beans, they must harvest a bean field and place the new bean card where the old bean cards were. As mentioned, when a player does not have space, they must harvest beans. When a player harvests beans, they may only harvest a field with 2 or more cards in it. The only time a player may harvest a field with less than 2 cards in it is if all of their fields have 1 card in them. When harvesting beans, the player will always do the following steps. First, they will remove all cards from the field they are harvesting and count the cards in that field. Next, they will look to the chart on the bottom of one of the cards being harvested. This is known as the beanometer. The beanometer will vary for each type of bean. They will round the number of beans they are selling down to the nearest number on the beanometer. If they have less than the lowest number on the chart, no coins are gained for selling those beans. Finally, a player will gain the number of coins corresponding to the chart. They will always gain between 0 and 4 coins for selling beans. This player sold 2 black-eyed beans, so based on the chart, they will find 2 and gain 1 coin. To show the gold coins they have gained, they will flip over a card to show the gold coin side. Any other cards that they have will be placed in the discard pile, and any gold coins gained will be placed in the player's player area. After a player has planted their first card, they may decide whether or not to plant the next card in their hand. If they decide to plant the next card, they will use the same rules of placing cards. If a player does not have any cards in their hand during this step, they will skip this step entirely. When a player has finished step 1, they will move on to step 2, drawing, trading, and donating bean cards. The second step of the active player's turn is to draw, trade, and donate bean cards. To start this step, the active player will first draw the top 2 cards from the deck and place them face up in the middle of the playing area. The active player must decide the fate of those 2 cards before they end this step. They have 3 options for how to get rid of the 2 cards. First, they can take one or both of the cards for themselves. They will simply place cards they take to the side of their player area in their reserve to be planted in the next step. The second option is to trade one or both of the cards for other players' cards. The third option is to donate one or both of the cards to another player or players. During this phase, the 2 flipped up cards are not the only cards that can be traded and donated. Players can also offer up cards from any position in their hand. The only catch is they must always trade and donate with the active player, so non-active players may not trade and donate amongst themselves. Let's take a look at the rules of donating and trading. Donating may seem a bit hard to grasp as a strategy for the game, because it is one player giving a card or cards to another player for nothing in return. Donating is a necessary strategy in the game. It is a great way for players to get cards in the order they need to play them later. When donating cards, the active player may donate any of the 2 flipped up cards or any of the cards from their hand. Non-active players may only donate cards from their hand to the active player. They may not donate to non-active players. A player may never donate cards from their bean fields or from those they have placed in the reserve. A player may donate any number or type of bean cards to another player. Trading involves a player giving one or more of their cards to another player in exchange for one or more of that player's cards. Trading must always be done with the active player, so non-active players may not trade with each other. The rules of trading are very similar to the rules of donating. The active player is allowed to trade any of the 2 cards they flipped up at the beginning of the phase, or any of the cards from their hand. And non-active players are allowed to trade any of the cards from their hand, as long as they trade with the active player. Cards gained through trade will never go into a player's hand. Step 2 is not able to end until both of the cards flipped up at the beginning of the step are taken. If no player wants the cards, the active player is forced to take them and place them in their reserve area. And they will move into step 3, planting their traded and donated bean cards. During step 3, all players will plant any cards they placed in the reserve during step 2. Each player may plant their bean cards in any order they wish, but all cards from the reserve must be planted. They may plant beans in empty fields. They may also place beans on top of like beans, and they may harvest and sell beans to make room for a new type of bean. If a player has 2 fields and would like to have a 3rd bean field, they may buy a 3rd bean field card. In a 3-player game, all players already start with a 3rd bean field, so they are not allowed to buy a 3rd bean field during the game. In a 4 or 5-player game, a 3rd bean field costs 3 gold coins. In a 6 or 7-player game, a 3rd bean field costs 2 gold coins. If a player decides to buy a 3rd bean field, they will discard the gold coins and place the 3rd bean field card with either side up in their player area. Beans may now be planted in the 3rd bean field in exactly the same way as they are in other fields, but now a player can have 3 different varieties of beans. After each player has planted all of their beans from the reserve, the active player moves on to the 4th and final step of their turn, The fourth and final step of a player's turn is to draw new bean cards. These cards will be placed in their hand. There is a special rule that players must follow when drawing new cards. When they draw, they will take each card one at a time and place them to the back of their hand. In a 3 to 5 player game, a player draws 3 bean cards from the draw deck, and in a 6 or 7 player game, the active player will draw 4 cards. If a player is drawing cards and the draw deck runs out, they will shuffle the discard pile and form a new draw deck and continue drawing. When the active player has finished drawing cards, their time as the active player is over, and they become a non-active player. The player to their left becomes a new active player and starts their turn at step 1. During the game, the draw deck will run out, and players will shuffle the discard pile and form a new draw deck. The length of the game is dependent on how long it takes the deck to run out a certain amount of times. In a 3-player game, the game ends when the deck runs out for the second time. In a 4 to 7 player game, the game ends when the draw deck runs out for a third time. The deck can run out at one of 2 steps during the game. If the deck runs out for the last time during step 2, when the player flips up 2 cards in the center of the playing area, they flip up as many cards as they can and complete all the way to step 3. If the deck runs out during step 4, when a player is drawing cards, they draw all of the cards that they can, and then the game ends immediately. At the end of the game, first, players set aside their hand cards. They gain no points for these cards. Next, they harvest any of their remaining bean cards in their bean fields and gain coins accordingly. When all players have harvested their remaining bean cards, they count up their gold coins. The player who ends the game with the most gold coins wins the game. If there is a tie for the most gold coins, the player with the most remaining hand cards is declared the winner.